everyone that we're live now. And so just give it a couple minutes before it starts. But good. Thanks, everyone. This is, Tuesday of UNGA. Happy, yeah. Um, all right. Looks like we are live. Happy Tuesday of UNGA, everyone. The formal kickoff of what's known around the United Nations as the general debate. The highlight, of course, this morning, or low light, depending on your perspective, was Donald Trump's address to the United Nations. So this is a special crossover episode of Global Dispatches and To Save Us from Hell. I am your co-host of To Save Us from Hell and your Global Dispatches host, Mark Leon Goldberg. Anjali, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm Associate Professor of International Politics at Fordham University in New York. And I teach and I write and I do research about the United Nations. And I spent all morning watching Donald Trump. 54.
54. I heard 55 minutes, but 50. I will trust your take, Professor. Maya, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. Introduce yourself.
Thanks so much for having me on. Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Ungar, and I am the UN analyst at the International Crisis Group. And I spend way too much time, energy, and effort thinking about everything to do with the UN. So I also spend most of my morning watching these speeches.
So, it is the Tuesday of UNGA, the big day, the kickoff of the leaders' speeches. None more anticipated than the speech from the President of the United States. And this one was a doozy, coming in at either 55 or 54 minutes, depending on how you count. It was Donald Trump's longest speech of his 5 before the United Nations. I am not going to tip my hand. Rather, Maya, I'm going to turn to you as our guest. What's your big takeaway, big top level reaction to what we just heard from Donald Trump at the UN?
Yeah, so a few key points. First and foremost, if I was Antonio Guterres right now, I would be a little bit offended, but not overall that concerned about the US pulling out of the UN. So I would be feeling a little bit of relief. I think going into Trump's speech, there was a lot of concern that he might. For example, announce U.S. pullout from particular UN entities, increase or huge decreases, really, of U.S. financial contributions to the UN. And I think, while he was critical of the UN, he accused them of creating and financing an invasion in the US's southern borders, unfounded claims. He didn't announce any of these big things that many UN officials feared. So that would be one of my takeaways, is not as scary for the future of the UN as some might have anticipated. A second is that he really didn't focus that much on global conflict, less so than I would have expected. He did make references to the fact that he has ended 7 unendable conflicts since his term has started, which is disputed by many analysts. But he really focused the primary bits of his speech on green energy, on migration, and really heavily on criticizing Europe and what it's doing both on green energy and migration, but also on Russia and a number of other files. So I actually think the biggest loser out of Trump's speech were the Europeans. I think that if I were them, I would come away with even more concerns about the future of the transatlantic relationship.
Mhm.
I guess 2 other quick points. One is that I was surprised by how little Trump focused on the Middle East. He did make references to Iran, to Gaza, saying he did make one short reference to recognition of a Palestinian state by France and the UK, saying that it was equivalent to essentially providing a win for Hamas. But there really was not much else there, where I think that's going to be a stark difference from many of the other speeches that we see over the next few days, where Gaza and the broader Middle East will really be top of mind. And then finally, one surprise moment, which got some chuckles from the crowd and also some everyone was texting me about, was Donald Trump's mention of President Lula and their brief interaction right before Trump came on to speak, as Lula traditionally speaks before him. Trump said that they will agree to meet next week. He said that they had excellent chemistry, which I think was a really surprising remark for us to hear, considering critiques he's made in the past of Lula. So that was one kind of surprising moment that will be interesting to watch how that develops.
Okay, Anjali, your big takeaway from this speech.
I'd say the one big news takeaway is that point that Maya just made at the end about meeting with Lula next week, right?
Mhm.
Lula's famously charismatic. It's maybe not that surprising that they met. And he said for 39 seconds, they at least had good chemistry, right? So we'll see what emerges from that. But that's obviously a key relationship. Um, Particularly key because Lula's speech ahead of time emphasized this sort of democratic accountability of holding Bolsonaro, you know, um, against impunity for fomenting a coup against Brazilian democracy. So there are two stark trajectories before us right now. And, the fact that Donald Trump is going to meet Lula sort of puts them on a convergence path. There's also the case that, Lula has been at the forefront of criticizing the Trump administration's lawlessness before international organizations and before international law, and that was on full display in this speech. We sort of stop remarking on it because it's so usual, right? But I don't usually sit down and listen to Donald Trump for this long. And I think that is also true for most of the people in that room because it is an unhinged experience, right? He led by saying that the teleprompter wasn't working. I've gotten a couple of texts from people who say that's actually not the case. So I'm not sure what exactly is going on there, right? But he then said he was going to speak straight from the heart. And we got a speech that was in equal parts non sequitur and bile, right?
Mhm.
Um, there's almost no point in parsing the sort of specifics of policy he lays out because really what most of it is empty signifiers for a particular worldview, right? And anti-migration, anti-diversity, anti-international law perspective. He got up there and he celebrated a bunch of U.S. actions that are in clear contravention of the UN Charter, right? Regardless of what one thinks of them on the merits of international peace and security, of international policy, they are clearly not in line with the terms of the UN Charter or with the core provisions of international law against aggression, right? Or, for the free movement of people. And so, in all those ways, we sort of priced in the fact that sitting through a speech like this is a very strange experience. But it's important to say it again, right? He got up there and for 54 or 55 minutes, he just talked about anything that came into his head. He mentioned windmills. He broke out the classic, with tears in his eyes. This guy approached me and thanked me. He said the countries of Europe were destroying themselves because of migration. There was a strange interlude where he said the escalator had broken with him and Melania Trump on it this morning, and how all he's ever gotten out of the UN is a broken escalator and a broken teleprompter. There was a moment where he threatened to sanction or tariff someone, not clear who, because of purchasing energy from Russia. Could have been India, could have been Europe, could have been both, right? Um, and, I think at one point he claimed Sadiq Khan was going to enforce Sharia law on London. I think it's important to put all these things on the table because it's so easy to forget that the context of what he's doing is bananas, right? But it is all bananas. And I think also we got this one really revealing moment in the middle, which I think for him is the core, basis of his relationship with the United Nations, which is that he once bid to renovate UN headquarters for $500 million, but they decided to go in a different direction. And he says with no terrazzo, with terrazzo instead of marble, and with no mahogany. And he says that was the moment when he realized they didn't know what they were doing. And then he said to the room, they didn't even get the marble floors I promised them. You walk on terrazzo,
Mhm.
obviously keeping people awake at night at the UN. But in that way, right, we saw the full encapsulation of what he is like. Very particular worldview that is anti-multilateralist, that is in some ways sort of embracing of the sort of form of the UN, where he gets to stand in front of people and talk about what he wants for a while, right? But it is also strangely light on substance except insofar as everything he says contradicts the core principles of international law.
So, a couple of things to unpack there from my perspective. One is, um, this notion that Trump once put in a bid for what was back in the day called the Capital Master Plan, and this is my 19th UNGA in 20 years, so I kind of lived through those renovations, which were major. It's like an old building and it was kind of falling apart, still is in some ways. And in like the mid 2000s, like I'm trying to remember, like around 2000, say 10 ish, was when they were trying to raise money to fund these renovations. And what's interesting to me about Trump talking about that at this particular moment is that, going into the first Trump administration, what we knew about Trump's relationship to the United Nations was exclusively through that failed bid to renovate the UN. Yet this is the first time he's brought this up, which I think is interesting and significant. Like, why now? Why is he bringing this up now? Um, the second kind of big picture point goes back to Maya, what you said initially to kick off this conversation, which is, maybe from Antonio Guterres's perspective, this wasn't like a disaster of a speech. Again, I've covered now 19 UNGAs, and I generally have an idea of what the US president is going to say going into the speech. And I had some idea. I knew that Trump was going to boast about his domestic accomplishments and kind of make the case that he should win the Nobel Peace Prize. What I didn't know was how strongly he would lay into the UN. He would criticize the UN itself as an institution. And whether or not, in the context of the United States not funding the UN, and clawing back funding that Congress had already appropriated to the UN, was he going to make some major announcement? He was going to be like, I'm going to pull out of the UN. I'm going to pull out of these UN entities until they do such and such reforms. He didn't do any of that, which I think could have happened, but didn't. So this was kind of like a bullet dodged from the perspective of the United Nations, at least. And Maya, I see you nodding.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is so much worse that could have happened for the United Nations that this in some way is a breath of relief. I would be interested if either of you have heard anything more about the potential Trump Guterres meeting that had been kind of rumored or discussed before High Level Week, as I think that also has the potential to have a pretty big impact on the way of the kind of future of US involvement in the UN too.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, as of the UN press briefing yesterday from the spokesperson for the Secretary General, Steph Dujarric, the meeting was on. And this is going to be the first meeting of Guterres in the second Trump presidency. But it's worth, pointing out that Guterres is like a politician and a former head of state, did a really good job, in my view, of managing the relationship with the United States during that first Trump administration. Things have kind of gotten off the rails now, maybe partly as a consequence of the fact that they haven't spoken. And what was interesting to me from Trump's speech is that as Trump was touting all of these like wars he supposedly ended, including like a mythical war between Ethiopia and Egypt, which never happened. He and including supposedly ending a war that's very much hot and ongoing between Rwanda's backed rebels and in the eastern DRC. That war is still, people are still dying to this day from that war. Very much hot. He claimed that like the UN didn't have a hand in it. The UN never like reached out, but like Guterres has been like dying to meet with Trump like since he came to office, but Trump like hadn't returned his phone calls until now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, I do think this speech could have gone a lot worse for the United Nations. I do think, first of all, a couple of things. First, we don't know, it wasn't delivered as written. We don't actually know what the speech might have originally said. And that's relevant because part of what's happening in the second administration is a change in staff, right?
Yep.
So in the first term, it is, by all accounts, from a lot of reporting, Guterres and Trump get along quite well, right? They actually built a very positive relationship in his first term, as you noted. A lot of that was due to the fact that he had a US ambassador to the United Nations in the first term who made that a key part of her sort of presence on the national stage, right? Who was a sort of conventional
Yeah.
liberal internationalist.
You're referring to Nikki Haley, of course, but go on. Yeah.
Haley, right? I'm referring to Nikki Haley, whose tradition of foreign policy is older in the sort of GOP tradition than Donald Trump's sort of MAGA route, right? And in that sense, and the fact that she could build a good personal relationship with both of them did a lot to secure sort of the US's investment in the United Nations. In his second term, the full-scale slashing of foreign aid, right, is the result of different staffing choices around him. And you can see the sort of like effect of that all the way down, including the fact that, Mike Waltz was in the chamber today, right?
Yeah.
He was there with Marco Rubio. I think he was there. I was it Scott Bessent who was there? Also, I couldn't exactly see who was there with him. But it was his first big outing at the UN. It's not a cabinet level position. He is not in particular favor with the Trump administration. He reports to Rubio. Um, it's not clear whether those connections exist, and we don't know what the speech said, which is
Mm.
to say that it is not clear to me in this second term that Trump is always clear on the foreign policy priorities of
Yeah.
his. And so I would, if I were Antonio Guterres, feel comparatively good that he didn't come out with all guns blazing.
Yeah.
But I also not necessarily overread into that, right? Because what is coming around the corner does not necessarily reflect what he got up and talked
Yeah.
about.
Well, one maybe case in point here is one thing I was watching for was whether or not Trump would repeat the lines given by lower levels of his administration that he rejects and denounces the Sustainable Development Goals. That was one, I was watching for that the entire time, and Trump never mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, which to remind viewers are a set of 17 goals that every country on the planet agreed to back in 2015 and are like non-binding on any one country, but they're very much like the organizing principle of how the UN operates around the world, in terms of seeking to, promote environmental sustainability and extreme poverty, promote global health. This is like the blueprint that the UN invokes when trying to do all these things. And earlier this year, the Trump administration surprised everyone by saying suddenly the U.S. rejects and denounces, is not, doesn't care for the SDGs. So it was at least notable that Trump didn't explicitly reject and denounce the SDGs himself, though, as you note, Anjali, it is a policy that's being pursued by other officials. Go ahead, Maya. You want to jump in?
Yeah, and I think one of Anjali's points is really, really important, which is that we don't know what was said in the speech actually reflects policy, and how much is just Trump kind of speaking from the heart. And I think that the U.S. Mission here has been leaderless from a political perspective, up until the end of last week, right? For the entirety of Trump's administration. So you had Elise Stefanik, who was originally supposed to come in as Trump's U.S. ambassador to the UN, who ended up pulling her nomination in order to help Congress kind of keep numbers, and keep a slim Republican majority in the House. We heard rumors that Mike Waltz, who has been sitting unappointed for months now, kind of threatened to pull his own nomination himself if there wasn't movement on it. And you saw at the end of last week, finally, a political deal made in Washington, which allowed Mike Waltz to formally be appointed as the U.S. ambassador to the UN. Now, what that means is going forward, essentially starting from this week, is that there is a level of high-level political leadership and connection to the Trump administration. While it might be, as Anjali rightfully mentioned, to Rubio, not to Trump himself, as you typically would have a cabinet-level position in other administrations, I think it will show a certain level of political connection that we haven't seen up till this point. It's something that I think many diplomats in New York are actually going to be quite excited about and grateful for, considering there has been significant issues really around the fact that no one can predict what the US is going to say or do or understand their direction. Now, not to say having Mike Waltz here will mean we're able to predict Trump, but we will have a better idea of where leadership will be going on the United Nations. So I actually think that point on Mike Waltz arriving is going to be really significant to see what elements of the things discussed in Trump's speech are actually put into policy and practice as we move forward with this administration.
Maya, I wanted to stick with you and kind of move this conversation beyond what this speech means for U.S. foreign policy and ask you how you think Trump's remarks were interpreted by the member states gathered in the room. I mean, when Trump, made his unfounded claims about Sharia law in London, you saw the camera cut away to the UK delegation, and they just sat like stone faced, expressionless. Similarly, when he made remarks about Germany and their dalliances with green energy, similarly, very diplomatically practiced, poker faces. But broadly speaking, what impact do you see this speech having on how other countries interpret American foreign policy?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think number one, the focus on and critique really of Europeans is really at the forefront of what this conversation was, and I think is something that not just the Western European countries, but um, Turkey, Russia, China will be reading into to look at the future of the transatlantic relationship. I think that this is further evidence about potentially American kind of critiques and move away from Europeans. But what I thought was really interesting was his critique of the Europeans was more on their domestic front. He said, "Oh, when I was in the UK, I kept on saying day after day to the prime minister that he should focus on oil in the North Sea." But he didn't really say as much about what, he had told the UK on Ukraine. And so I think that while the Europeans are likely going to be quite upset from this speech, it also could have been worse if he had gone out and kind of echoed more of, for example, Russian talking points when it relates to the war in Ukraine. So I think there is a dual side coin there where it definitely hurt the Europeans the most, but interestingly, it was on their domestic issues, less issues of European overall security, which is really top of mind for many of these leaders, particularly with incursions in recent weeks, like the incursion of Russian fighter jets into Estonia on the 19th of September, a couple of weeks ago, drone attacks in Poland. So I think this issue of European security was startlingly quiet, actually. For other member states, I think it was interesting to hear him remark about his friendship with the Gulf countries in particular, noting with positivity his trip earlier in his term to Saudi and the UAE and Qatar. That's particularly interesting because of what's expected to come later today, which is a meeting of a select group of these Arab leaders with President Trump to discuss particularly the situation in Gaza as well as the broader Middle East. So his kind of reinforcement of the positive way that he saw that relationship, I think, is something that they're going to be taking well and trying to build onto when they have this very important closed door relationship. Um, on the Latin America side, I think it was really interesting to see his, obvious heavy critiques of migration. I think that was unsurprising to all, but I think what was leaders would probably be watching out a little bit more for is the way that he was talking about recent American incursions in the seas around Venezuela in particular. And he made it clear that he saw that as a moment of strong American strength, and kind of threatened further action like that in the future. So I think from the Latin American side, that is what I really would have been paying attention to, as well as his potential open or overtures towards President Lula. And then finally, just to quickly touch on Africa, he didn't. Uh, so I think that is an indication by African leaders that Trump is not really prioritizing their continent. He did mention Rwanda and DRC very shortly, talking about the nastiness of the conflict and how he put an end to it. But Mark, as you very rightly mentioned, past the important symbolic Washington Declaration, we haven't really seen much implementation. And there continues to be active fighting between the M23 and Kinshasa's forces. Finally, getting to Asia, I think the main takeaway was about China. Um, Interestingly, while he did kind of criticize in some ways China and their carbon footprint, the message that I really got, which I found quite fascinating, was him saying countries like China are not abiding by international laws and norms, so why should the United States have to? He didn't really talk about South China Sea, he barely touched on tariffs or economic issues with China. Instead, he said, they're not playing by the rules, so I shouldn't have to either.
Yeah, Angela, you're nodding along. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that was a terrific summary of the sort of like range of points that he made, classified by region. The one thing that I will add was that he did spend a little bit of time talking about the war in Ukraine. And he said, he thought it would be the easiest war to broker an end to because of his relationship with Vladimir Putin. And he said, but war is full of surprises. Who knew, right? Um, and I think the UN camera operator cut to Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation. They, I think, are not learning anything that they didn't know before, right? And I think that is an interesting feature of a speech like this, which is it can be so long and so disarming and actually offer almost nothing of substantive learning.
Yeah. The ambient sounds of UNGA in the background.
Ambient sounds of Midtown Manhattan.
Yeah.
So I think one of the fascinating things about listening to Trump is traditionally an American president, everything they say is understood to constitute U.S. foreign policy, right? They tend to be low on noise, high on signal, right? But he's exactly the opposite in the sense that he can speak for 55 minutes and you can actually learn nothing new about policies from those 55 minutes. And I think that's largely what happened here. World leaders are not learning anything new about him that they didn't know before. Um, to the extent that there is some new information here, I think the fact that he would get up and celebrate what are war crimes against humanity, right? Against Venezuelan civilians. Who knows? Maybe Venezuelan civilians, maybe someone else. We don't know because we don't have that information, right? Is not, I think, surprising to world leaders anymore, right? But what they are looking for, as Maya said, is maybe some sense of how he casts it, right? What is his own understanding of what has happened? And how can they work within that framework? So to some extent, right, world leaders are essentially becoming graduate students, right? Parsing
Mm.
text for meaning as opposed to for information, right? They're parsing text for context and language as opposed to for learning something new about the way he sees the world or what he plans to do. In part because, in that first term, he did have a more legible US ambassador to the United Nations for a large number of leaders, right? But she was sort of running a parallel foreign policy out of New York to some extent. He actually has that now writ large, right? A lot of what we see now is in Project 2025. A lot of it separately is the result of Elon Musk's moves at Doge. But together they constitute parallel foreign policies to whatever it is what he gets up and says. And so, in that sense, when they are trying to sort of interpret what he is doing, they also have to look at, interpret what he's saying. They also have to look at, in a broader sense, what his administration is doing. So,
So yeah, no, no. I mean, that's like a really, really important point because the broader context in which this speech occurred is one in which the United States has retreated from its kind of traditional obligations and roles in multilateralism in general and foreign policy in general, cutting of most U.S. foreign aid, the non-payment and the rescission of payments to the United Nations kind of is a signal that the United States is no longer going to be like the leader of the world or the leader at the UN that it once was. When you combine that with like the rambling and sometimes incoherent nature of his speech, which did not articulate, any broad kind of foreign policy vision around which countries, good or bad, might rally, then you kind of combine those two. And to me, this speech really did kind of signal an end to the pretense of American leadership at the UN. Maya, you're nodding.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I agree on the sense that it ended in some ways a pretense of American leadership. But what I'll be really interested in watching is if any other member states step up over the next couple of days, because I think there has been this question of a kind of a dual-natured question we talk about Trump's speech and U.S. involvement is how much are we going to see a pullback of U.S. involvement? And second is how much is that going to affect the overall UN system, right? On the financial side, that's very clear with the U.S. being the greatest financial contributor to the United Nations, but it's still kind of unclear how much other countries will step up. There's been a lot of rhetoric in American news media in particular about China and how they will kind of fill the gap in the UN system. We haven't really actually seen that to the extent that it's been predicted. China has, for example, increased its investments in the World Health Organization, but in other aspects, I mean, China has been one of the most stringent, if not the most stringent, on the Fifth Committee, which is the kind of budget negotiations of the UN system. They also pay a lot of money this year for the first time. They're reaching up to 20% of the UN's budget, and they're quite concerned about the financial costs associated with that. And so I think that some of the narrative around U.S. involvement has been a little bit, or around Chinese involvement has been a little bit overblown. I also wanted to quickly just touch on something Anjali also said earlier, which was the lack of much substance in Trump's speech. And I think that there was one thing that came out that I thought was interesting to follow up on and potentially a positive for the United Nations, which was Trump's kind of brief mention to the U.S. Starting to lead an effort to use AI in some ways to enforce biological weapon conventions. I wasn't fully sure what he meant by that. I'll be really interested to see what the administration comes out with in the next few days. But that was the one thing he noted positively, is where he said, I hope the UN can play a constructive role here. And so if I was Guterres, if I was UN officials, I would be thinking, okay, how can we be aligning on this priority? That has actually been a pet project for Antonio Guterres. He mentioned technology for human advancement as one of his 5 priorities that he laid out in his speech before Trump came up to the podium. He also has made it clear that AI and technology is going to be a big area of interest for him as he looks to kind of cement his legacy as a Secretary General. He will be leaving his term at the end of next year. So I think that's actually one area I would be looking for potential future collaboration.
So maybe in conclusion, it's worth noting that, Trump is one of over 130 presidents and prime ministers who are speaking before the United Nations this week. And Anjali and Maya, I'm curious to learn from you, what other speeches are you anticipating this week? Anjali, go ahead.
Can I go back for a second and just
Sure. Yeah.
on Guterres?
You do you, Anjali. I'm along for the ride.
Uh, the I was a little surprised by Antonio Guterres' speech because it was surprisingly relaxed, maybe even
Yeah.
a little ill, given his speeches in the last 5 years. We are all like veteran UN watchers. He has occasionally had the affect of a doomsday preacher at that rostrum, right? He is fire and brimstone. He has invoked the horsemen of the apocalypse from that rostrum. He has called out specific billionaires. He has talked about the pandemic revealing that leaders could get an A in science but would get an F in ethics, right? And that is not the route he went today. And I'm interested in why, because the sword hanging over the United Nations is lower than it's ever been. And he has responded with, I think, a much more relaxed kind of speech. He definitely hit the same 3 themes that he's been hitting over the years, right? He talks about how we're living in a world of impunity, inequality, and indifference, right? And his speech, I think, it's the 80th year, it's the 80th anniversary of the UN's foundings. He spent a lot of time in his speech about how multilateralism was not naivete, and the founders of the UN were actually embracing a hard-headed kind of pragmatism. But that is an almost conciliatory pitch to the people in the room. An um, it is not, I think, in a sort of oppositional speech. And I am interested in trying to understand what brought about that shift, right? Is it that he thinks he has less political capital to yell at the people in that room? Is it that he thinks that a constructive pitch is better for them at this particular moment? Is it that he has new speechwriters, right? Is it that he is tired? Is it that
Yeah.
he doesn't want to make one of 2 bonker speeches? I don't know, in the room that
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure why, but I was struck by the fact that usually he gets up there and his speech is essentially, "We are going to die unless you do something."
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Not what he said today.
That's interesting, and, I interpret that in part, in the context of just how, like, morose the mood is around the UN. Just talking to people these last few days, staff cuts are, you know so many people are being laid off or about to be laid off. You have these grinding wars in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan that the UN is unable to do much about, and there's this kind of loss of a sense of purpose combined with just individuals around the UN thinking they're going to lose their job because the institution is in such like dire financial straits that I wonder if maybe adding like the apocalyptic eschatology that he had in the past might not have been an opportunity to buck up his staff. But I'm also aware of the fact that to a certain extent, maybe he had an audience of one when in Donald Trump. Maybe he's trying to set the stage for his meeting later this week with Donald Trump and trying not to emphasize the negative, but potentially try to find opportunities where he might productively engage the United States. That's my take. I don't know. Go ahead, Maya.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is my take as well. Anjali, that was also one of my big takeaways from the speech. It was the main thing I predicted wrong, as I expected him to come out with a fire and kind of brimstone, hell-raising speech in a way that we've seen in the past. And it seems like he was really focused on this lens of constructive engagement. And I agree, Mark. I think it's because he was speaking to this audience of one. I think it is so rare that Guterres knows Trump is listening to him. And so I think he wanted to portray the organization in a bit more of a positive way. He also seemed to kind of position himself a little bit farther back. He's starting to enter his lame duck phase as the Secretary General. And we've seen this as we discuss UN 80 reforms. Diplomats have said we want more initiative, we want more radical reform coming from the Secretary General. And the Secretary General has said, I need more direction from you. And so I thought his framing, he kind of reiterated the phrase again and again, what type of world will you choose, was quite interesting because it was a recentering of the membership as the primary decision maker for the United Nations. And I think that's quite indicative of the way he will view the rest of his term, where we're not going to see much splashiness. He, in some ways, has not exactly given up, but kind of stepped back and said, I'm going to shepherd this organization through to the next Secretary General, and that's the best that I can do.
So we seem to have lost Anjali. So, Maya, I'll stick this last question to you. Again, what other speeches are you looking towards anticipating the rest of the week?
Yeah, the speech that I will be watching with the most excitement after President Trump's speech will be that of the Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara that will be
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Did you just as a quick aside, did you see that remarkable moment across town at Concordia, another kind of international gathering sponsored privately, not part of the UN formally, but in which General Petraeus, his former foe, who jailed him for 5 years in Iraq as a leader of Al Qaeda in Iraq, now become HTS, they just kind of reconciled on stage. It was wild.
It was really crazy to see. It was also so interesting. I saw the photos of him walking off the plane. He had a shorter, kind of well-maintained beard. It's clear that he has come here with a very particular purpose and message. The first time in, I think, almost 6 decades that a Syrian sitting president has been to the United States. And one who will be taking the podium tomorrow while still under UN sanction, which is something that hasn't been talked as much about, but is quite significant to see. So
Mhm.
I'll be really interested to see the way that he's received by world leaders, but also the way that he talks about the future of UN engagement in Syria, as the UN's role is currently undergoing a complete reconfiguration in the country. And I think based on what he says at the podium tomorrow, it will help to shape a lot of the way the UN will be approaching it moving forward.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Huge thank you to Anjali Dayal and Maya Ungar for chatting with me for our annual live UNGA chat. Thank you all for viewing and listening to this, if you have a chance, please do become a paid subscriber to Global Dispatches so we can keep bringing you this very special UN content. Thank you so much. You get a 40% off coupon as well by going to globaldispatches.org/40% off. That's the word percent. Thank you all for watching. Thank you, Maya, and thank you to Anjali.
Thanks, Mark, for having me on.
All right, stay hydrated.
You too. Bye.